Kia ora everyone, sorry I'm late. I got caught up. It's a busy time, and so I had a phone call at 7:30, and it led to another phone call, and hopefully it's all for a good cause. So now I'm on different things, so you can see the background in the room, but I'm gonna tutu. So feel free to stay away. I will do a reading, but I've got this new...
But Tangaroa also shows that Tangaroa can flow, it can shift, it can move. And it is a constant movement that Tangaroa has, where it shifts from one position to another. You go down to the beach, you get a stick, and all that taumaha, if you've got 1 or 2 or 3, maybe a million taumaha, try and wrap it all up into 1 or 2 words. Apai? Wrap it up into 1 or 2 words. Get a stick, go down to the water, as Ricky has described, when the tide is outgoing, right? Because you don't want to get your taumaha go into a tide that's incoming. All right, so when the tide is outgoing, get your stick right by where the water comes up, write the word in the sand. All right, and then you stand there, and all you do is you think about, I'm going to let this shit go. And eventually, the wai miri of Tangaroa will take that away. And when you see no more word in the sand, ko haereki. Kei te pai?
Just to reframe on the word shit.
Oh, sorry.
It's not serving you, but it did serve you.
Let me cleanse it.
It was really important. Something happened to you, and so you got reactive, you got quick-fired, you got hot-headed, you became angry as a person, and the anger was absolutely valid. We mean that shit. Not shit like it's not okay to be angry, but the anger is getting in the way from you being able to move into huaki pauri. No one else has to know it. It's not a long psychiatric comprehensive assessment. We don't need to know your whole life for you to shift your perspective. But honestly, I really need you guys to think about what you contribute to a problem and how you relate to others. Ka pai?
Let me land free from it all. From it all.
Morena. MCAM live streaming. I like the little logo up in the corner there. I don't like that you can see this bedroom space. I much prefer Turu Makina's art in the background, but lovely to be here. And I hope that this is of value to those of you who are tuned in. Morena to everyone. So this, I really mucked it up, but then time got away with me. But I'm going to get better at this. Imagine if the 1 o'clock, 6 p.m. News didn't start till 6:20. It's like, sorry if you arranged your time to be here at 8. This is the book that I'm going to just do some readings on, and it is by a psychiatrist, Dr. Joanna Moncrief, a straight-talking introduction to psychiatric drugs, the truth about how they work and how to come off them. It's interesting reading backwards. My name is Dr. Diana Kopua. I am an independent psychiatrist, a fellow of the Royal Australia New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. I pay my annual fee so that I remain a college member, and I'm sure it has its benefits. I was a psychiatric nurse back in 1990 to 92. I did my training in Purirua and went straight out to be a nurse who focused on working with only Māori and using Māori approaches inside, alongside and then inside a kaupapa Māori a mental health service. It was amazing in the 90s, and we really were using Māori approaches, but you know, one of the things that we didn't appreciate is the ngangara of the kaikiritanga and how racism is so flexible and adaptive that every time you do something that prioritises indigenous knowledge systems, it will almost insidiously or just really implicitly and sometimes explicitly get in the way. And the way that I saw it back then is that whenever there was someone who was hugely distressed, we would look to the psychiatrist and psychologist. It wasn't until the time that another psychiatrist, another Joanna actually, Dr. Joanna McDonald, asked us to consider developing and coordinating, facilitating training for doctors who were training to be specialists in psychiatry, so that we're training to be psychologists. So we were the first Māori health training in New Zealand for training psychiatrists, and it was in Wellington, so the lower North Island. And it actually fell from the work of Dr. Eddie Hannah Ryan, a Māori psychiatrist living in Australia, and my supervisor, so Mahi to her. And it wasn't until I did that training, or I facilitated and coordinated, we developed it alongside of Lisa Cherrington, Māori's clinical psychologist, and a writer, a creative. It wasn't until then that I looked at those people who were training and thought, wow, I could do this. Yeah, I could do this. And that's when I decided to go to medical school. And that's another story. I'm going to carry on with this reading. So far, for those who have just tuned in and haven't watched the other readings, I think we're up to number 5. So in summary, illness, considering emotional problems as an illness, comes with the problem of thinking that it is then left in the hands of people who work with illness, and people who work with emotional problems who are specialists inside an illness system are psychiatrists. And the problem with that, and psychiatrists I think have a lot to offer, but the problem with leaving it to the psychiatrists is that then everything rests on the shoulders of those experts. And as you can see now, the mental health problems for Ngai Māori are not good. And so we know that institutional racism is there, that these places aren't culturally safe, they don't reflect the culture of those people with the problems. And so we believe, and so does this book reflect, that mental health problems actually rest on the shoulders of everyone, all citizens. Everyone has a stake in ensuring that we develop systems and processes, a way of being that improves the well-being for everyone. So if you're an employer, the effective care will look different to a mum. So effective care and best practice is actually relational or relative. Actually, it's relative to your position and your relationship to the person who is in distress. So we then moved into talking about psychiatric medication. People who, and the language that they use, no, let me backtrack. The next point in this reading, in the introduction, was to say that knowledge is power, and part of that power sits within the language we use, and also the knowledge that we get can sometimes be, or a lot of the times, is governed by those in power. So to have something be evidenced and published allows everyone in training and for all of us in society to consider what works and what doesn't. The effectivity is looked at through what's been researched and published, and the gold standard is a randomized control trial which randomly selects people to a particular treatment, whether it be a new medication or a talking therapy, compared with doing nothing. And that's the gold standard, but there are other ways of determining evidence. And even if there are studies that have gold standard evidence, some of them, if they are not revealing messages or evidence that are consistent with what people in power want to roll out politically, then they're not likely to be published. If they upset the group who govern the publication or the journals, then they're not likely to be published, or the writers are asked to reframe things. So it can take years for some articles with evidence to be published, and even when there are publications, in particular with psychiatry, we're not paying attention to them. And two examples. There was a Finnish study, a 7-year study. So when people experience madness, of which in psychiatry they call psychosis, so they use the language delusions and hallucinations and psychosis. So if I use that language, and it is just a language that people made up. It's like you see a territory and say, I'm going to name it that, and then I'm going to build my empire to help you understand what that land looks like, smells like, and what to do with it. And then what you have is commodification of a health system that doesn't necessarily work for us. Whew, I just deviated. Let me come back. So a 7-year study of people who had first episodes of psychosis, and they followed those people up and discontinued their medication, and followed them over 7 years, and found that their social well-being, their quality of life, had improved much more than those who were told to stay on medication for life to prevent a relapse. And that idea that there's this chemical imbalance and that you need to take medication because of the chemical imbalance, even though chemical imbalance hasn't actually been proven. Right, so morning everyone. Just a short reading today to say the layout of the book before we actually get into Chapter 1 tomorrow. I start by, and so this is an introduction to that. I start by explaining the different theoretical approaches to understanding how psychiatric drugs work, comparing the disease and drug-centered models of drug action, and looking at the contrasting implications these models have for how we approach the use of drugs to treat mental disorders. I examine the nature of research on psychiatric drugs, the methodological limitations of common research designs, and the biased reporting of research data. After this, I look at the evidence for the effects of the main classes of psychiatric drugs that are currently used, including the antipsychotic drugs, also known as neuroleptics, antidepressants, mood stabilizers, or drugs used for bipolar, stimulants, and benzodiazepines. I describe what we know about the various mental and physical alterations that each different class of drugs produces. I then inspect evidence from clinical trials about whether these alterations have beneficial effects on the symptoms of various disorders, and as measured using standard methods. In response to increasing concerns about the difficulties of withdrawing from psychiatric medication, I have devoted a chapter to the nature of withdrawal from the different classes of drugs and current advice about how to manage the process of withdrawal. Finally, I make some suggestions about how we have got to the position we're in, where there is a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature and effects of psychiatric drugs. The misunderstanding has led to millions of people being prescribed drugs for mental health problems that are unlikely to be useful and likely to be harmful, at least to some degree. I draw some conclusions about the information people really need to have available to make sensible informed decisions about whether to start or whether to continue taking psychiatric drugs. Throughout the book, I have had to make use of terms that I do not necessarily endorse. The names of some classes of drug, for example, as an antipsychotic and antidepressant, reflect the presumption that they act in a disease-specific way. Yet the whole of this book challenges that presumption. These terms are now so commonly used, however, that alternatives either do not exist or are no longer widely understood. I have elected, therefore, to use the terms that are in most widespread use currently, despite their implications. Similarly, the idea that psychiatric disturbance is a medical illness is so entrenched in our culture that it is difficult to avoid the use of medicalizing language such as illness and treatment and patient. Even a term like mental disorder suggests that mental health problems like illnesses or diseases are things that people have. Yet, along with many others, I subscribe to the view that these problems are better explained as things that people do and ways that people experience and react to their individual circumstances. However, alternatives to all these terms are often clumsy and their meaning is not always clear. Therefore, I have retained the use of this language in much of this book for the sake of simplicity and readability, but this should not be taken as an acceptance of its full medical implications. I really hope that that was helpful for you. I have a couple of whakaaro. Firstly, if you come to our Mahi Atua training, we engage in karakia taku whare wānanga, and it represents some of these houses that we have inside ourselves, like whare tōpito i ra atua, whare ngākau i ra wairua, whare whatu manua i ra tangata, whare hinengaro i ra tipuna, whare waha i ra whenua. That whare waha i ra whenua is really telling us we grow what we speak. And what Dr. Joanna Moncrief is saying is the fact that when we have emotional disturbances, when we have mental health problems, and we call them mental disorders and diagnose them, and we call the care we provide treatment, when we call the medication taken antidepressants or antipsychotic, it implies that it is a treatment for a particular illness, of which this book is trying to get us to think differently about. It's also the position of Te Kurahuna, who do the Mahi Atua training, that say we think that the psychiatric classification system and that we use to describe distress and concerning behaviour is not just harmful, it's damaging to our people. We think it's likely damaging to everyone, and there are alternatives, but it, like Joanna said, this way of knowing has been ingrained in our culture, even our Māori culture, as we think about mātauranga Māori and kaupapa Māori approaches to understanding distress. We are still indoctrinated into a medical system. And just think about that. You have a kaupapa Māori service and you're employed as a cultural worker, and you're going to provide a wraparound service using big hearts, manaakitanga. But as soon as they start, people start getting anxious about what's in front of them, we often resort to a Western approach. And that's not necessarily just because you want to, it's because we haven't been resourced with the ability to develop our own systems. We definitely have our own language. Mai rāno, we've had our language. The fact that we don't speak fluent Māori and aren't connected to our pūrākau doesn't mean that the language isn't there. Our tohungas have been left on the fringes as our experts, and we've been looking to psychiatrists and psychologists as the experts to understanding mental distress, which is why I love working alongside my husband and tohunga, and his knowledge is profound, and being able to, and even though it's profound, when I start talking in regarding this sort of stuff, he'll give me not so deep analogies, like the idea of the revolutionizing the mental health system is pretty much just a communication. We're focusing on our communication. It's like just moving from Vodafone to Telecom. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's from Mark. It's just a simple analogy, and I completely agree with it, the way that we're talking to each other. So I'll come back tomorrow with, I'll try and be here at 8 o'clock with chapter 1. And chapter 1 of this book is, let's have a look. The place of drug treatment in psychiatry. So I'll come back tomorrow. Here's the book. I'm just reading Henrietta's post. That's why no one likes to admit they're overwhelmed. The language used to describe what we're going through is so damaging instead of encouraging. Yeah. And the way, a Mahi Atua way, for those engaged in tūpori ariki, I hope that that's what you're experiencing right now. They create a space for you to find the language to describe your distress. That's what's most important. There is a reason that you've broken or that you're heavily, intensely affected emotionally, and it's really important that we create a space so that we're almost a mirror onto you, sharing pūrākau with you, so that you can shift your way of thinking about your problem. And some of our stuckness is because we see the problem in one particular way, and the problem won't go away. And I guess that if we accept that the problem will always have a place in your life, whether it be a memory, an experience that will always be there from now on, you may shift from it. You will never be able to eliminate the experience. And medication doesn't do that. It just numbs your connection to that experience. It won't ever take the memory away. And so how do you shift your thinking to see the problem differently? And that's your journey. And we hope that our Mahi Atua wānanga helps with that. Ata mairi e Jarell. So kia ora everyone. I hope that that was helpful. Take care, and I'll see you tomorrow.